Well, thank you so much, and thank all of you for coming out. Especially, I'd like to thank the Wakefield family. Charles Wakefield, could you stand up, please? And Ron Bain, could you please stand up, sir? The Wakefield family, of all the descendants of the men who thrust their spirits against Everest, was probably one of the most helpful to me in the course of the research. And really, as you'll see if you open the book, it was a story of Charles's grandfather that really allowed me to begin the narrative, as you'll see as I begin my remarks tonight. So I'm extremely grateful. And those of you who are really lucky, this is actually, thanks to Charles, the ice axe that Arthur Wakefield carried up Everest in 1922. So afterwards, you know, you can come up and you can touch this, and you'll feel the resonance of these remarkably heroic men. And one of the most delightful things about writing this book was to discover that the two great unsung heroes of Everest were both Canadian, including Arthur Wakefield. But more on that. Thank you. You know, everything you know of your life, every sense you have of the modern, every intuition, every neurosis, every doubt, every point of confusion began in the mud and blood of Flanders. A single bullet fired in the summer of 1914 into the breast of a prince in Sarajevo shattered a universe, a realm of certainty, optimism, hope, and faith. And this, amazingly enough, was the world of our own great-grandparents. For a century, Europe had been at peace even as industrial miracles created wealth and power beyond anything that had ever been known. And so, like children at a birthday party anticipating cake, the European powers had sliced into pieces and consumed the confection of a planet. Each took what it could until the boundaries of imperial ambitions literally tightened like a noose around the neck of civilization. Then that single shot in Sarajevo sparked the greatest cataclysm in the history of humanity. We tend to think, particularly from the American perspective, that the Second World War was somehow divorced from the First, but of course Winston Churchill, who lived through both conflicts at the highest echelons of power, with his historical perspective knew quite well this was all one war. He called it the 30 Years' War, and he said, never was there a war less necessary to fight than the first, or one more essential to win than the second. It was that battle that broke out in August of 1914 that created the bloodstained century of violence that birthed such luminaries as Stalin, Hitler, Mao, notions of nihilism, anarchy, chaos. It even gave fertility to the ideas of Freud, who told us that you didn't control the sanctity of your thoughts, or Einstein, who said that gravity is not what you thought it was, or even Darwin, who said species were mutable. So this is really the backdrop of the story that I'll tell you tonight, a story that for me began quite innocently in the spring of 1996 when I traveled 4,000 miles across Tibet from Chengdu in western China to Lhasa and beyond to Kathmandu. And as we passed Everest, it was the month where the famous debacle happened that John Krakauer so powerfully wrote about in his book Into Thin Air. And with me was Daniel Taylor, who was a close friend of mine, who was a veteran of 45 expeditions to Tibet. It was Daniel, more than anyone, who had been responsible for the creation of the Chomolungma Nature Preserve that embraced the flanks of Everest. And Daniel's image of Everest was not the ignoble commercial scene of today that had resulted in such tragic loss of life. It was the pristine vision that Mallory sought in 1921. Daniel's father, a medical missionary, had been a very close friend of Howard Somerville, who climbed with Mallory in 1922 and 1924. And the very next year, Daniel and I returned to Everest to try to photograph snow leopards at the base of the Kanchung face and clouded leopards further down the valley of the Gama toward the Arun. And we got caught in unusual snow conditions. And Daniel suddenly began to speak of the Everest of his youth and these stories of these men who, dressed in tweed, flung themselves against the rocks, reading Shakespeare to each other at 23,000 feet in the snow. Well, I was captivated. And I returned, and I happened to drop by a good friend of mine, Don McLeod's used bookstore in Vancouver, and as Don and I were chatting at the till, I looked behind his head and I saw on the shelf of rare books first editions of the 1921, 22, and 24 expeditions. And those three purchases became the first acquisitions of a research library that in time would grow to 600 volumes for this book. And what interested me from the very start was not whether Mallory reached the summit. Now, those of you who may not be familiar with the story, of course, is the British sought out the flanks of Everest as a geographical expedition in 1921, the first Europeans to embrace the mountain at close quarters. They then returned in 22 and 24 in an attempt to climb the mountain, and famously on June 8, 1924, observed by Noah Odell, a brilliant climber in support, 37-year-old George Mallory, 22-year-old Sandy Irvin, two black dots on the skyline of the northeast ridge were seen slipping away toward the summit, even as mists rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. Neither man would be seen alive again. So the question that has haunted mountaineers since then is, did Mallory get to the top or not? But being who I am, I couldn't care less about that question. I wanted to know what was the spirit that drove them on. I knew, simply being an Anglophile, being Canadian, knowing where they had gone to school, what age they were, and what class they represented in the British hierarchy, I knew that it was quite likely that every one of those men who went to Everest in those three expeditions had gone through the fire of the war. And my thought from the very start was that perhaps they had seen so much of death that death had no mystery for them, save that of their own, and that life mattered more than the moments of being alive. And perhaps this was the idea that pulled them toward Everest. So from the very start, I set out to try to find out, of the 26 men who went to Everest on those three expeditions, what indeed had happened to them in the Great War. Now, it was famously said of the battles of Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. Well, if that was true, they kept records of just about everything else. That war was so thoroughly documented that it's amazing men found time to fight. And because the zone of operations was so astonishingly small, you know, you forget about it. The entire British zone of operations was smaller than the English county of Lincolnshire. The British front was never longer than 125 miles. For much of the war, it was 85 miles long. Behind that frontage, the British would build 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. The Ypres salient, where 1.7 million boys of both sides of the conflict died, a man could walk around in a small day. It was 4 miles by 12 miles. And because the zone of operations was so small, and because so many millions of men had been poured through it, and because in the wake of the war there was a tsunami of reflections, journals, diaries, poetry and prose, there was no corner of that battlefield that had not been documented in multiple voices in poetry and prose for every single day of the 4-year and 4-month conflict. So it was possible with the regimental diaries to identify with a specificity that I would never have thought possible where each of the young men had been every day of the Great War. And these moments, of course, were chronicled with so many different voices, from the kind of the haunted cries of a shattered subaltern to the bombastic boasts of a Yorkshire sergeant. And as I went through the military archives, in fact, in time visiting no fewer than 60 of them in Europe, North America, I found that it was, in a sense, I was on my own journey through a twilight memory of hell, as Siegfried Sassoon famously described shell shock. At the outset of the war, a man had to be 5'8" to be recruited to the British Army. Within 2 months, men 5 foot tall were eagerly accepted. Cremation was unknown before the war as a way of dealing with the dead. In the wake of the Great War, it became the preferred form of disposal of the dead for countless thousands, because so many men had lived for all those years with a scent of putrescence and rotten flesh in no man's land. Plastic surgery was born of the war and the need to repair the shell-scarred faces of young boys who for the rest of their lives would wear plastic masks that in public and go to these holiday camps where they could remove the mask so that they could allow the wind to touch their gargoyle features without shame or humiliation. The regular British Army required 2,500 shovels. In the mud of Flanders, 10 million would be required. 25,000 Welsh coal miners spent the entire war underground, tunneling under enemy trenches to light charges of TNT that would echo on the downs of Surrey and be heard at Hampstead Heath in London and shatter the windows at houses above the white cliffs of Dover. The army would need, over the course of the war, 108 million battle dressings, 22,386 artificial eyes. Every single month, the British Army needed 10,000 young officers to replace the dead. And these mostly came from the public schools. Charterhouse, where Mallory taught, Winchester, where he went to school, Marlborough, that saw 733 of its graduates dead in the trenches, Eton, Harrow, Uppingham Academy. These schools didn't graduate their classes to Oxford or Cambridge during the war. They went right to the trenches where many of them died. The chances of a young subaltern from one of these public schools surviving the war were 1 in 2. So in the end, there were nearly 1 million dead in Britain alone, 2.5 million wounded, 40,000 men without limbs, 60,000 without sight, and 65,000 who never returned from the mental ravages of shell shock. The poet Ivor Gorney famously lived until 1937 in an insane asylum, still convinced the war raged. And before he slipped into madness, he had literally walked across England to Liverpool when he got out of the army, trying to find a ship that would take him anywhere just to get away. The agonies, the economic agonies, are hard to believe. Taxes and death duties in the first year of peace were such that more land exchanged hands in Britain in 1919 and 1920 than had done so at any time since the Norman conquest. Women talked about the war through the metaphor of dance. Nancy Cooper famously said, by the end of 1916, every boy I had ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said there was no one left to dance with. And Stephen Spender said that in the wake of the war, the British middle class continued to dance, unaware that the dance floor had collapsed from beneath them. So if the quest for Mount Everest began as a grand imperial gesture, redemption for an empire of explorers that had lost the race to the North and South Poles, in the wake of the war, it became a gesture of regeneration for a nation and a people bled white by that war. As I said, of the 26 climbers who went to Everest in those 3 expeditions, 2 were too old, Sandy Irvine famously too young, Guy Bullock was a diplomat, Bethley Beetham sat out the war as a schoolmaster, but 20 most assuredly did see the worst of the fighting. 6 were severely wounded, including Jack Hazard, who climbed Everest in 1924 with open, bleeding wounds from the Somme that would never heal, even as he climbed the North Col of Everest. 4, as surgeons and army doctors, dealt every day for 4 years and 4 months with the agonies of the dead. John Knoll, who went to his death, speaking of his great career in the trenches in a way that even his own daughter was unaware, I discovered that he had in fact hovered in a hospital in suicidal depression throughout the war, a victim of shell shock. 2 had lost brothers, 2 had nearly died of disease at the front. All of them had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the bones and wire, the white faces of the dead. In August of 1917, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who was Mallory's mentor and the greatest climber of his era, recorded in his diary a list of all of his good friends who had died, a list that reached 25. And that left room still for his acquaintances, another 25. 50 men that he knew well slaughtered at the front. Young had been at Ypres on April 22nd, 1915, when the Germans attacked using poison gas for the first time, and only the suicidal resistance of the Canadians kept the Germans from breaking through. And this is what he recorded in his journal that night. This horror was too monstrous to believe at first, but when it came, far as we had traveled from our civilized world of a few months back, the savagery of it, of the sight of men choking to death with yellow froth, lying on the floor and out on the fields, made me rage with an anger which no later cruelty of man, not even the degradation of our kind by the hideous concentration camps in later Germany, ever quite rekindled. For then, we still thought all men were human. Geoffrey Winthrop Young was the mentor of Mallory, and as I discovered thanks to the Wakefield family, on the very day, June 8th, 1924, when Mallory and Sandy Irvine disappeared, there was another climb in the British Empire of a more modest peak, the Great Gable, the most beautiful of all the hills of the Lake District. Leading this climb was Charles Wakefield's grandfather, the owner of this ice axe, Arthur Wakefield. He was leading the people of the Rock and Fell Climbing Club, along with Geoffrey Winthrop Young, to dedicate a bronze plaque to all the members of the club who had perished at the front. Winthrop Young had to struggle up the slopes because he had lost his leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front, and as the wind whipped the cape from his back, he watched Wakefield move ahead. When it came time to dedicate the plaque, Arthur Wakefield stepped forward, and just before he took the rain-soaked Union Jack that had covered the bronze, a flag that flew on the battleship Barnum at the Battle of Jutland, Wakefield began to speak of the breath of the Moor, the spirit of self-sacrifice that had led them all, even as he put it, at the risk of their own self-obliteration, to march off to France. And then, according to ocular witnesses, Arthur Wakefield suddenly began to cry. Great sounds of grief that were heard across the entire Lake District. And then he stopped. And as his son Bob told me when I first met him, thanks to Charles, never again would his father express human emotion. Not one of their children or descendants would in his presence see the inside of a church. He went to his death a lovely man, but with one abiding memory, a hatred of all things German. Now, I became instantly fascinated as to what happened to this extraordinary man, because I knew from the family that Arthur Wakefield had entered the war a man of rich and deep religious faith. He had been part of the Grenville Mission in Labrador. He had been one of 2 physicians doctoring to the entire people of a part of Canada that had a 5,000-kilometer coastline. What had happened in the war? Well, I knew that Wakefield, with his own personal money, had armed the the Legion of Frontiersmen, which was sort of a colonial militia that was forged all around the empire. And when Newfoundland, as an independent colony, declared war in the immediate outbreak in Europe, this militia became the seeds of the legendary First 500 of the Newfoundland Regiment. I knew from the documents that Wakefield had sailed from St. John's with the Newfoundland Regiment, joining the Canadian flotilla that sailed to France in August of 1914. They trained on Salisbury Plain until the regiment peeled off to the Mediterranean, eventually to fight heroically in Gallipoli, and Arthur Wakefield himself went to France, where he became a surgeon at a casualty clearing station. Now, by this point, the severity of the medical challenge had come through to the Allied forces. And the challenge for the wounded was this. Every battalion had roughly 16 stretcher parties for battles that had 50 and 60 and 70% morbidity and mortality rates. So if you were wounded in an attack, you were on your own. You crawled, walked, or were carried back to what remained of your trench. Undoubtedly, your first aid post had been annihilated by an enemy artillery barrage. So you found your way back to these tent complexes behind the front, one artillery shell away from the front line. There you entered a process of triage, where if you were severely wounded with no hope, you were simply marked with a red cross, placed in the moribund tent, and left to die, hopefully with an injection of morphine. to be buried in a body bag the next day, not in those little neat rows of white crosses that were only erected after the war to satisfy the living, because the dead had no such happiness, or they were put in mass graves without crosses. Those who could walk or move in any way were instantly evacuated to the hospital trains that took them to the hospitals on the French coast and then on to Victoria Station, the hospitals of Britain, through the gate of no return, where women would wait to bring back the wounded, even as they would dispatch new forces of the youth to the front to die. I found out, and these casualty clearing stations were haunted places where 8 surgeons working around the clock in 6-hour shifts would have to deal with these floods of the dying. Now, I remember there's a great story of Jeffrey Keynes, the brother of John Maynard Keynes, who was Mallory's best friend, was actually in one of these stations, actually in a dungeon in a castle, operating late in the war on the mutilated genitalia of a private, when he looked up from his procedure and saw King George V at his side. Without a gesture toward his sovereign, without a word, he simply mopped his brow and went back to his work. These stations were absolutely extraordinary. And I had this idea that perhaps, just perhaps, what happened to Wakefield was connected to those boys of his beloved Newfoundland Regiment. And thanks to Charles, I had a letter from Wakefield to his wife, censored, that made reference to an architectural feature that placed him in Albert, in Belgium, on the eve of the Somme. Now, they weren't moving surgeons out of that battle zone a month before the biggest attack of the war. And I was able to ascertain that the Newfoundland Regiment, reattached to the 29th Division, actually marched through the area en route to the Battle of the Somme. And this allowed me to know that actually Arthur Wakefield was waiting behind the lines by complete chance at the very casualty clearing station that would be waiting to treat the wounded of his beloved boys of Labrador. Of course, on that first day, the most horrific day in the history of British arms, at a time when the entire British forces had been told to anticipate 9,500 casualties. That was all the medical facilities could support. And of course, within an hour, probably 20 minutes of the attack at 7:30 on July 1st of 1916, the Fourth Army alone would suffer 57,000 wounded, 35,000 dead. And the extent of the debacle of the Battle of the Somme was unknown because of the duplicity of the British press. And the people actually at the front had no idea whether it had gone well or badly, except that they could see the seas of wounded coming back to them. Wakefield spent days going through the wounded, trying to hear from anyone the lilt of the familiar accent he knew so well. See anybody who wore the blue puttees unique to the Newfoundland Regiment, or in fact the insignia of the caribou, wreathed in sheaths of olives that was unique to the regiment. It was as if the entire regiment had simply vanished, and indeed it had. And this was a story that broke his spirit, because in some deep metaphorical sense, he had literally brought into the world all of the dead of Beaumont Hamel. And this is an excerpt from the book that describes what happened to his beloved boys of Labrador. In the noise and chaos and horror of the battle, all communication collapsed. A false report of a glorious victory resulted in even more men being fed to the slaughter. At 9:15 a.m., the Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to advance. Their right flank hung in the air because the 1st Essex, the next unit in line, had been delayed reaching the starting point by the sheer volume of dead. Shells landed on corpses, and flying fragments of flesh and bone blinded the living. Men enveloped in flames went mad and fought each other as they died. The soldiers of Wakefield's beloved Newfoundland Regiment barely got out of their own trench, and when they did, they floundered and died at their own parapet, their ranks swept by German machine gun fire. Those few who advanced slowed and faltered, burdened by their loads, leaning and bowing into the storm as if to limit exposure to the lead. The British artillery barrage, timed to the second, had long since moved ahead and away from the immediate battlefield. Men dropped dead at every yard, and still the regiment pressed on. A few miraculously reached the German line, only to be shot down in the mud or skewered on the wire, which was not cut. Indeed, the last thought of many of these brave men, breathless with exhaustion, blood-whipped and deranged with fear, was a horrid realization that the German line was utterly unscathed. Nothing had been damaged at all. The preliminary bombardment had missed. In fury, they spun into the wire, tossing grenades, their screams baffled by the throaty gurgle men sound when hit in the brain. Altogether, 810 men of the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top that morning. Depending on who you listen to, either 34 or 68 emerged from the battle physically unscathed. Every officer was lost, and only the commander who sat out the battle was there to hear the praise of General Haig, who famously said that it was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed because of success, because dead men can advance no further. Now, it wasn't just Arthur Wakefield. Howard Somerville, Mallory's closest friend on Everest, was also a surgeon, and he was there as he walked out for his shift, having been told to expect 1,000 wounded. Instead, he walks out from his Marquet tent and is surrounded by 6 acres of dying boys, piled up like cordwood, as he described. He would never come back from India after his first attempts on Everest. He became a medical missionary in the south of India, devoting the rest of his life to saving the living, that he might try to sweep away the memories of the dead. Winthrop Young was an extraordinary character who would gather at a place in Wales called Pennypass all the finest thinkers and poets and climbers of the generation before the war. And this was not some kind of unusual thing, because climbing was the ethos of a place like Cambridge and Oxford, and these weren't simply children of the Victorian era. These were bohemian rebels with a new vision of life itself, inspired by a great philosopher by the name of Moore, who had written a treatise that Lytton Strachey described as being as important as the writings of Christ or of Aristotle. It was this extraordinary philosophy that swept the halls of Cambridge and Oxford before the war, in which everyone was completely dedicated to authenticity, transparency, poetry, purity, the aesthetics of beauty. Everything was about how do you live in the moment with love and beauty in your heart. And that's exactly what gave rise to the kind of bohemian sexuality of the Bloomsbury cult, Bloomsbury set, or the neo-pagans of Rupert Brooke. And the reason that George Mallory had a love affair with James Strachey, that somewhat left him embarrassed, not satisfied, but he, at least James had struck home, because every man in Europe wanted to bed George Mallory, from Duncan Grant. John Maynard Keynes, Geoffrey's older brother, famously was known at Cambridge as the iron copulating machine. Sexual freedom was part of this ethos of freedom that almost is analogous to the best part of the 1960s. And so all these poets and historians and writers and climbers would come together on holiday in Pennypass, like Siegfried Herford, the man on Mallory's right, your left, who of course was obliterated by shell fire at Ypres. And Geoffrey Winthrop Young used to keep a photographic album, which he called the Pennypass Diary, and of the beautiful and honed faces of the men, 23 would die in the war, and 11 be so severely mutilated that they would scarcely walk again. When it came time to actually put together Everest expeditions, the older climber Tom Lovestaff famously said laconically that since the war, the supply of climbers is not what it once was. So if the war informed and haunted the lives of these men, the expeditions themselves were not isolated adventures, but from the very start, imperial gestures woven into the fabric of the Raj. The Indian Raj, the British Raj, was the most extraordinary thing. 1,300 Englishmen, dominating a fifth of humanity. As Lord Curzon famously said when asked why there was not a single Indian in the Indian civil service, he said, because in the entire subcontinent, there's not a single man capable of the job. Mercantile zeal, severe military reprisals, the co-optation of local elites played a role in the creation of the British Raj, but what really held it together was the sheer audacity of the effort, the sheer gall of a small island nation that never set out to rule the world, but did so with such flair.